hope many of you know him already, and I bet that's why you're here. Esley's legacy career is 40 years with St. Louis County Parks as a historian and preservation. He has taught historic preservation at WashU School of Architecture and Design and landscape architecture as well. And the most exciting thing for my world is that Esley wrote the nomination for the park's National Historic Landmark status, a fact that we rarely write a sentence that we don't talk about that. So it's very important to the park's notoriety and the park's current success. And I give you Esley Hamilton.
One of the reasons why there are so few landscape nominations is that they have had a lot of trouble getting people to write them. And so we probably could have 3 or 4 times as many parks and gardens as National Historic Landmarks if we got around to nominating them. Historic preservation started very slowly in this country, but one of the first preservations was actually before most European countries, and that was the preservation of Independence Hall, which was acquired by the state of Pennsylvania to keep it from being torn down, to raise money for a new state capital in Harrisburg. And of course, Washington's Mount Vernon was a landmark because that was a national effort that was done privately without any federal assistance. But starting in the 1930s, the National Park Service became more and more interested in historic buildings, and you're probably familiar with the Historic American Building Survey, which actually started here in St. Louis in 1934, which identified and measured drawings of historic buildings, many of which were subsequently demolished. But the real massive threat to historic buildings occurred with the federally funded programs that started in the 1950s after World War II. One of them was the Interstate Highway system, and I love this picture because it shows the corridor for Interstate 70 photographed from over downtown. And way up at the top of the picture you can see Holy Rosary Church, the 2 towers. And it just created like a canal through the middle of this historic neighborhood. And they're talking about this now nationally. And one of the effects of that was that when it divided neighborhoods, then one side or the other kind of collapsed. And you could, if you drive north in St. Louis today, you see everything on the riverside of Interstate 70 is gone. And so it was more than just the buildings that were immediately torn down. And then the other thing was urban renewal. And for example, in Mill Creek Valley, which was one of the largest urban renewal projects in the whole country, the AIA made a list of buildings that should be saved. There were only 8 buildings on the list, and they didn't save any of them. So everybody was thinking more and more that something had to be done about this. So the biggest single incident, though, was the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in New York. And a lot of very prominent people fought against that. And in this picture you see, this is Philip Johnson, and this is Aline Saarinen, who was the widow of Eero Saarinen, and she was also the cultural arts correspondent for the Today Show. So she had a national audience too. And that shows them tearing down that spectacular building. So finally, in 1966, and keep in mind the Civil Rights Act had just been passed the previous 2 years. So the Congress was in a state that is hard to remember now, but they were actually doing things. And they passed the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This is a cartoon that was published in, by Historic Preservation magazine at the time. And it set up the National Register of Historic Places. And that was a list that was of historic buildings worth saving that was primarily intended to guide federal agencies. So buildings on the National Register could not just be torn down and bulldozed for urban renewal and interstate highways. There had to be some study about whether it could be mitigated, moving the building or moving the project. And, but it was not an ultimate protection in terms of not tearing the building down. And now we have over 90,000 listings on the National Register, and some of them are large neighborhoods that include hundreds or even thousands of buildings. And much of St. Louis is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But the National Historic Landmark Program had actually been started by the National Park Service before that. They had taken some of their earlier efforts and combined them into a designation system that was officially launched in 1960, when I think 72 properties were designated National Historic Landmarks. That was supposed to serve two purposes. It was supposed to pinpoint buildings that were nationally significant, not just locally significant, but ones that really, if they became threatened, we needed to go all out to preserve them. And secondly, they wanted to put the brakes on other federal agencies. So they designated a lot of buildings that were already owned by the federal government just to control the departments that were in charge of those buildings. So in 1966, when the Big Act was passed, the landmark system was just folded right into that. And some of the earliest listings on the National Register were buildings that had already been designated as landmarks. They were just moved over. And so today we have about 2,500 National Historic Landmarks that are about 3% of the total listings. So to give you an idea of what kinds of buildings are significant, I'm going to show the ones in this area, and a lot of them will be very familiar to you, but some will probably be not familiar at all. And the reason for that is that their designations tend to be done as a result of studies. They'll study, for example, the history of recreation in the United States, and look at, for example, all the baseball and football stadiums, which ones of those are significant, and kind of winnow down to the most significant things. You can nominate a building to the National Historic Landmark designation system, but you have to do that kind of study yourself if it hasn't already been done, because it has to be in a national context. And the reviewing committee is like a great, I guess like the deacons of a church. They're like the most famous people in historic preservation, and they meet once or twice a year. Under Trump, they pretty much shut the whole program down, but now they're getting it back going again. And instead of telling you the date of the building, I'm telling you the date it was listed. So the first building structure actually in this area was the Eads Bridge, which was listed in 1964 as part of a study of bridges. Anheuser-Busch Brewery was one of the first on the National Register in 1966. It's not the whole factory, but I believe there are 3 or 4 buildings. The Wainwright Building in 68, the old post office in 1970, and of course the mate of this one, the executive office building next to the White House, was listed at the same time. Union Station in 1970, and of course these listings played a huge role in whether these buildings could get funding. When you think of them, you think of all the effort that was made by various governments, like in the case of the Wainwright building, the state saved it. In the case of Union Station, it was private developers, but using massive federal tax credits. I believe just the tax credit for Union Station was $125 million. The Joseph Erlanger House is on Waterman Avenue, west of Kings Highway, east of Union. He was the head of the medical research department at Washington University School of Medicine in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And he won the Nobel Prize in physiology, and he also hired several other researchers who went on to win the Nobel Prize. So he's considered one of the key figures in that big part of medicine. Scott Joplin, of course, the great ragtime composer, and at the time this was listed, very few people even recognized that this was a historic building at all. All the preservation of it occurred much later. The Missouri Botanical Garden was listed, I think, at the same time as the New York Botanical Garden. And the Gateway Arch is a great example of a federally owned building. So it actually owned by the same National Park Service that has the Historic Preservation Program. But they wanted to make sure that everybody recognized the importance of this. And they had one of their staff historians come to St. Louis and work for 2 years just researching the landscape. And of course that research turned out to be invaluable when they did all the renovation here recently, because they knew what were the most important features of the landscape that meant the most to Saarinen and to I've forgotten his name. Dan Kiley, thank you. So there was a little bit of friction there in the federal government, but they've gone on to designate quite a few other properties that are in the national park system itself. And then we were listed in 1989, and that was an individual nomination, not part of a study. But I had to mention a lot of other places in the nomination. When the civil rights anniversaries started coming up, and also as a result of the anniversary of the Constitution in 1987, a lot of properties were listed that reflected some of the key decisions. And Shelley versus Kramer, of course, was the one that said racial covenants could not be enforced. And it's interesting that this has come back just in the last year or two, and people are doing new studies of which subdivisions still have those racial covenants in their documents. Not that they can be enforced, but it's still something that would be nice to get rid of completely.
What street was that on, the Shelley House?
I've forgotten. It's about 2 blocks west of the area that would have been known as the Ville at that time. So it's in walking distance of Sumner High School, for example. But because it was right next to a black neighborhood, they had put this deed restriction to keep the blacks from moving west. But a lot of people had been ignoring that because there was so much pressure to live in that area. There wasn't any housing left in the Ville neighborhood. And it just happened that this particular one was sold to Mr. Shelley, the black buyer, and one of the neighbors objected, and that's how the thing went to court.
4600 Lavity.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Google.
Christ Church Cathedral was listed not as an example of Gothic revival architecture, but as one of the few surviving works of Leopold Eidlitz, the architect. Most of his work was built in New York City, and of course it's all been torn down. But he was the rector of the church here, Montgomery Schuyler, was from New York and knew of Eidlitz's reputation, and so he commissioned him to design this. It was designed in 1859, but they only got construction started when the war broke out, so it wasn't occupied until 1867. And the tower and porch were not added until 1910, but following more or less the original design. And they changed the stone because they discovered in that 40-year interval that the sandstone was deteriorating because of the terrible air pollution we had here. So they switched to limestone, which gives it that two-tone look. Most recently, the Eugene Fieldhouse has been designated, and that was, as you can see from the date, that was on the anniversary of the Dred Scott decision. Of course, our courthouse is associated with the Dred Scott decision, but of all the people who were involved with that case, the home of Roswell Field is the only one that's still standing. And Field was the lawyer who took the case from the state courts and filed it in the federal courts, which is how it got to the Supreme Court. So this is really a major landmark of the civil rights movement. And it's interesting that we had such a mix of people in St. Louis at that time. We always think of Missouri as being a border state, but there were a lot of abolitionists here too. And now you see that the interpretation of the house has changed somewhat because of that renewed emphasis on Roswell, as well as his son, Eugene. I'm going to just talk about the National Historic Landmarks outside the city limits, and also in chronological order. Whitehaven, Ulysses Grant National Historic Site, was designated in 1986, and I wrote that nomination also. And it, of course, now is a unit of the National Park Service and magnificently restored. And most of the license plates you see in the parking lot are people from other states. I think more people from outside St. Louis are going there than local people. Washington University was listed as part of that National Recreation Survey that I mentioned earlier, because one aspect of that was World's Fairs. And this is the largest collection of buildings from any of the World's Fairs, although not the oldest, not the only one, which you'll see a little bit later. And it's also significant as one of the best examples of the style of architecture, the collegiate Gothic style, which was really coined by these architects, Cope and Stewartson of Philadelphia. Cahokia Mounds, it might look like this by the end of today, but this was listed before the Historic Preservation Act, and it's now a World Heritage Site as well as a National Historic Landmark. But this is what the mound might have looked like when the village was new. And here's an aerial view showing the oxbow of the river that was just to the north of the village site. In Cahokia, the Church of the Holy Family is the oldest French Catholic church in the United States, because all the French Catholic churches in Louisiana were rebuilt, and this is still just barely in the 18th century, 1799. And just 2 doors down from the Church of the Holy Family is the Nicholas Jarrot Mansion, which was listed, I think, primarily because it's one of the first brick buildings built in the Midwest here. In the French colonial period, there were no brick houses in St. Louis at all. They were either stone or wood. Now, here's one you probably never heard of. In Alton, Lyman Trumbull's house was listed, and that's because he wrote the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in the United States. He was a U.S. Senator from Illinois. He was actually kind of a moderate, and he, I think, voted against the 14th Amendment, but anyway. And another important architectural landmark is Principia College Historic District. This was totally unknown to the National Park Service landmark staff, but it turns out that Bernard Maybeck, who designed this is the largest collection of his work anywhere, even though he's really associated with the San Francisco area rather than the Midwest. Now, we've had 3 boats listed on the National Register of National Historic Landmarks. Nationally, about 100 of them, 100 floating objects have been listed as National Historic Landmarks, but they have a very high death rate compared to other buildings, and this is what it looked like originally, and this is the last picture that I found of it. So it has been delisted, and the USS Inaugural sank in 1993, and that's a picture of it. I think it now has been removed completely. And then the president was listed under St. Louis because it happened to be birthed here at the time the nomination was written, but it really was not based here for very long. It was mostly in Iowa. And I noticed they may officially delisted it in 2009. So now let me turn to the parks. The earliest one is the Boston Common, which goes back to the founding of Boston in 1630. I believe it was officially set aside in 1640, but that still makes it much older than any other public park. The New Haven Green is also listed as a National Historic Landmark. It was about 1700, I believe. And this is a picture from the 1860s, and it shows the upper part surrounded by trees is the Common, and the lower part here is the Boston Public Garden, which was laid out in the 1860s as part of a landfill operation that created the Boston's Back Bay, Commonwealth Avenue, and the other streets that lead from the downtown Boston out toward the campus of Boston University, and also the Back Bay Fens and Fenway Park, or the west end of the Back Bay. That would be this area down here. You can see that it already had been beautified by the time this drawing was made in the 60s, because all these trees are in parallel rows. Probably originally it was just a meadow that was totally on the landscape. Here's a view that probably, this may be the last cow that was able to graze on the Common. I believe the people who lived on Beacon Hill had the privilege of having their cows graze on the Common. But this also shows this building here and this building here were the entrances to the first subway station in the United States. And that's a National Historic Landmark in its own right. And the tower of the church is Park Church. And here you can see in the aerial view, there's Park Church on the right, and on the left here here's the gold dome of the state capitol from 1796. One of the important landmarks of that period. Charles Bulfinch was the architect. And this is Beacon Street here. Here's an early view of the Back Bay, the Boston Public Garden. And this was, in contrast to the Commons, was much more heavily landscaped. It had kind of a wide variety of tree species and big plantings every year. And you can see all these great tulips. And they have a friends group that actually was founded after our friends group, but they have now like individual histories of every tree, and their annual report lists what happened to, if there was any tree that had something happen to it. And this is the famous, it's only 67 acres in comparison to our 296. And the most famous thing is the Swan boats, which are still floating. You can see old photographs of them also. And also the park is famous for Make Way for the Ducklings, the children's book. And there's actually a sculpture in bronze of the ducklings, and I think at life size. Probably the most famous individual park in the United States is Central Park, and it is important as a work of art, but it's also important as the park that caused every other city to want to have a large park. There were many parks in other parts of the country, but they were small. Our, say, Lafayette Park is about 35 acres or something, and that was the typical size of a city park up until Central Park. And of course, it also is a significant work of art that cost a fortune to build. The two designers who won the competition for the design of the park were Calvert Vaux, who was an architect from England, who had come here to work with another landscape architect, but he became friends with Frederick Law Olmsted and persuaded him to join the competition in 1858 for the design of the park. And I show these fairly early photographs because this is about the age they were when they won the competition. Later, Olmsted was known as the founder of the landscape architecture profession in this country, really. And most of the pictures you see of him are as an ancient builder, but he was once young. So this comparison here shows that this is what the park looked like when they started. It was not very well landscaped. It had very few trees. It has many large granite rock outcroppings all up and down it. And there were actually some shanty towns too. And I believe there's some archaeology going on now. That was an area right in here. And it had a reservoir that was part of the New York water system, bringing water from the Adirondacks. And but it was rectangular, which was contrary to the style of the park. So up above is what it looks like now. And all the little dots, if I'm understanding this correctly, those are statues. So they have a huge number of statues, which was not something that Olmsted wanted, but he had to make do. And you can also see that it extends farther than originally intended. But this property line here went right through the middle of one of those outcroppings that actually had a convent built on top of it. And they decided it was easier just to buy more land so that they wouldn't have to run a street through there. And the convent is gone, but the rock is still there. You can still see it. that, and I don't know if you can see this too clearly, but the circulation plan of the park is very complex. There are three kinds of circulation patterns. There are drives for carriages inside the park. There are bridle paths inside the park, and there are roads that cut through the park from east to west, from Fifth Avenue to Central Park West. And there are four of those called transverse roads. And when you're in the park, you cannot see them unless you really look closely, even though there are few bridges and tunnels, but they're mostly open, but they are sunken and they are densely planted along the side. And this is the northernmost one. Then the gray blob there in the center is Metropolitan Museum. And there's one to the north of that and one immediately to the south. And then the fourth one is here. And this is where the zoo is, near 59th Street. So as a result of that, the park is full of bridges. The most famous part of it is the Bethesda Fountain, which has a long axial mall leading to it. But most of the landscaping is very natural, and many of the rocks are integral parts of the landscape. For example, on that spit to the right of the statue, on the other side of the lake, you can see the rocks. This is the mall. And this is one of the bridges. I want to say there are 40-some bridges. This is a bridle path, and this is a carriage path. And that's a cast iron bridge. And this is the longest bridge, the Bow Bridge, looking to the west. This is the Dakota Apartments. And especially to the north, but also immediately north of 59th Street, are areas that are very natural looking, although they were all created artificially. For example, you can see there are natural rocks on the hillside on the right there, but the bridge is stone, and it just blends right in with the natural topography. And there are even log bridges that this was recently restored. Now, the Balboa Park is in San Diego, and in 1915, California had two World's Fairs, one in San Francisco and one in San Diego. And they had slightly different names, but the one in San Diego was never really demolished. It was reused in 1934 for a second thing. And since that time, many of the buildings have been reused as museums and institutions. And the famous San Diego Zoo is not part of this, but it's just adjacent to it, to the east. And you can see how large it was. So when you go there now, this gives you a better idea of what the large World's Fairs were than any other place in the United States. Here's the entrance, this tower called the California Tower, and the dome, they look like it's a cathedral, but actually it's called the Museum of Man, and that was designed by Bertram Goodhue, who was one of the leading architects of that period in the whole country. The main entrance went right through an arch that was attached to this complex here, and down a street called the Paseo. And this is a greenhouse. It's actually a slat house because there's no glass in it. It's just the framework. And these are the more typical buildings with the arcaded walkways. Meridian Hill Park is located due north of the White House on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. And it was the brainchild of a Missouri woman named Mary Henderson. Her husband was the U.S. Senator from Missouri for many years at the end of the 19th century. And actually, she published a cookbook, which is still a source for high-style recipes of that era. But she wanted the 16th Street to be the center of the embassy area, and it was not going her way. It was going out Massachusetts Avenue instead, which was kind of northwest instead of due north. But there's a bluff line, which is called the Fall Line, which runs all through Maryland and Virginia and even North Carolina, that separates the Piedmont from the Tidewater areas. And that's what she took advantage of. So she thought if she built this park, that would attract more embassies and large mansions. So there is a cluster of significant buildings around there. But this cascade of 17 little falls is actually based on the Villa Lante, a famous 16th century garden outside Rome, which was one of the main sources of that Renaissance revival style at the turn of the century. Particularly this three-part composition that's like a Palladian window. And they couldn't afford marble for all this, so they used aggregate stone, which is still holding up pretty well. This is what that same hillside looked when it was first planted. There was so much land moving, ground and earth moving, that was required for this, that even though they started it in 1915, they didn't get around to planting until 1930 or so. And at the top, above the terrace, it's a large, flat meadow. At the end, let me go back. This is the axis you see when you first walk into the park, across this reflecting pool with the fountains. And at the far end of it is this statue with this long exedra, it's called, to James Buchanan, who was our 15th president right before Abraham Lincoln. And I read recently that he was considered our 45th best president. This shows you the wall along 16th Street that holds up that meadow at the top of the hill. So you can see why it would take a long time to build this. The landscape architect was Ferruccio Vitali, who was really an Italian, but he did several major estates and institutional buildings in the United States. And this is often thought of as the most perfect Beaux-Arts or Renaissance revival garden in America, especially as a public park. By contrast, Columbus Park in Chicago is considered the most best preserved building by Jensen, who revived the idea of using native plant materials. He could look at America's landscape with fresh eyes because he was born in Denmark and actually didn't come here until he was through college. He became the administrator of the West Park System in Chicago. Chicago had 3 park systems. The South system was, the designer was Frederick Olmsted. Jensen was the West Park system, and the North Park system was Ocean Simons, Simonds, who was also an important designer. But Jensen said, we've got to use the native plant materials because this climate is so severe compared to Europe. We can't expect to transplant landscapes from Europe to Chicago and have them thrive. And he also worked in St. Louis. He designed the Carswell subdivision, which is right off Whiteout Boulevard in Clayton in 1923. And I talked to a woman who grew up there. Actually, she was a benefactor of the park here also, Marcella. What's her last name? Yeah, McDermott, yeah. And she said that there were so many dogwood and hawthorn planted in Carswell that in the spring there would be traffic jams of cars driving around to see those, because that was the only place you could see them in the city, that they were considered weeds and everybody ripped them out. So we all have a lot to thank Jensen for. He founded a school in Wisconsin called The Clearing in Door County, and that still is active today. And you can go there for summer sessions or I think throughout the year. And this was a pond, a swimming pool that he built, but he built it to look like it was natural. And so all those rock ledges are man-made. And if you look at some of the renovation that was done to our forest park on the east side of the park, you'll see very similar ledges that were built here about 2010. And here's another view. This is all artificial, but made to look like a natural landscape. You can also see another park he designed just south of Springfield, Illinois. When you drive to Springfield, you cross a lake on the south side, and the whole east edge of that lake is called Lincoln Park, which he designed. And you could see his signature thing, which was he called a council ring, which was a circular seating area of natural-looking rocks. And he wanted people to sit in circles because that would promote conviviality. So that's it. So are there any questions? We have a few minutes. No?
What does the designation mean to someone, to a park like ours here?
Well, it's the honor of it.
Yeah.
As he mentioned, that I think fundraising has been much easier because it's a National Historic Landmark. People won't quibble with you about whether it's important. But also there is an emergency fund that the National Park Service keeps, and buildings that catch fire or other things like that, they can come in with some emergency fundraising. And also they, as I mentioned at the beginning, they are very firm with other federal agencies if they want to tamper with a National Historic Landmark. That's almost impossible to do.
I would say in reality too, so National Historic, Susan, back me up on this, because Susan Lambert is a mayor's commissioner, a landscape architect, and she's on a building to the ground. So if I'm saying this right, the National Historic, the National Parks gives authority to the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, as we call it. And so I, as the fundraiser, not the guy who does the projects, I'm always very confused about what the line is that you can do and can't do. One of the things we can't do is imitate anything Victorian, right? But it has to be consistent with the design. What's consistent? I'll give you one example I know of the last 2 years' work around the park. As the landscape architects were redesigning the East Stream, right off here is, you'll soon see, is the headwaters area of the East Stream. They put, the original design had like fallen logs and fallen trees, like in the new Forest Park recreation area.
Mhm.
And Shippo said, no, no, no. In the garden-esque style of Henry Shaw, you would never, in a Victorian park, you would never allow a fallen tree to lay as a thing to play on. So they redesigned much more architectural, invisible structures. So it doesn't come without some encumbrances.
Well, you were using a federal grant though, right?
No, that was all privately funded.
Oh, really? Well, you really didn't have to consult with them. But it's good you did. Henry Shaw originally set aside a strip 200 feet wide the whole way around the park that he was going to lease for people to build their villas. And that was not turned over to the park until 1926. And so there's less historical features in that area. In fact, when they did acquire that strip, the thing about the villas, the land rentals were supposed to go to the garden, not to the park, to support the work of the garden. So they had to agree to relinquish that claim to that 200-foot strip. And thank God they did. And
So where is that? The strip?
the whole way around the park.
So if you go to you know where the columns sit in?
Yeah.
Okay, so that could have been the backyard corner of your villa that sat on Arsenal or Magnolia. In your backyard would be the park.
Yeah, if you
So nobody wanted to do a 99-year lease for land from Henry Shaw when I could go over and buy land on Thurman or or any of the other streets around here.
Yeah. The clearest example is as you're coming into the park from Magnolia and Tower Grove Avenue, there are those two pylons with the stags at the top. That's the 200-foot mark. And
The back, that's the back.
The backyard,
Yeah.
that's right.
And
And
then we entering.
on the Arsenal side too, the reason why we have all these pedestrian entrances is that those would have been the only way into the park if that had all been built up. Yeah.
There is a house off of Magnolia in the park. How did that one house get there?
Originally, the original land grant had a notch it started right opposite where the garden clubs is now. And I think there were maybe 30 acres in there going west to Kings Highway. And there had actually been 3 houses built in that area by 1910, and that's when the park bought that strip. And the 2 of the houses were framed and were moved across the street, and I guess they were subsequently demolished. But that brick house remained, but that was not built by the park or as part of the park design.
Does the park own that building?
Yes, they own all that land on the south side of Magnolia.
And who lives there?
It's leased to a staff member.
Yes.
Can you touch on the significance of the pavilions and how unique they are among even the national landmark parks? That these are
Right.
really, there's nothing like this.
As far as I know, Eden Park in Cincinnati has 3 pavilions, but there's no other park in the United States that has as many as we do, 11, I think, or 12. And of course, Central Park has a whole range of pavilions of different sizes, but I would say there maybe, if you take out the larger buildings, there would only be about 10 or 11 of those also. So, and the fact that they were designed by 2 different architects is interesting too, to see the taste of the era. So yeah, that's definitely one of the unique features of the park.